The dust moves before the bodies do. It swirls in the wind, clinging to the torn edges of silk robes, to the exposed teeth of skulls whose flesh has long since gone to the crows. The air is thick, stale, wrong, as if the land itself is still holding its breath. Beneath the pale sky, the earth is studded with bones, not buried, arranged. A pyramid rises here, not of stone, but of human skulls. Hundreds, no, thousands, stacked with grim precision, bleached by the sun into a ghastly mosaic of sockets and grins. Each layer a testament, each hollow eye a silent scream. The people who lived here once had names, families, gods. Now they are mortar for a monument of terror. The legend says the Mongols were unstoppable horsemen, swift, disciplined, brilliant. The truth is darker. This was not simply war. This was a calculated performance, a message carved into the landscape in bone: submit or become part of the pyramid. And across Central Asia and the Middle East, that message stood for decades, sometimes centuries. Pyramids like this were left in city after city, not to win a battle, but to erase a people from memory. Tonight, we strip away the legend of Mongol glory and walk through the dust of their most chilling legacy, the skull pyramids. The grasslands breathe in silence before night. Endless wind-scoured plains stretch in every direction, an ocean without water. The horizon is a thin bruise of gold fading into blue-black, and the air carries the cold bite that arrives the moment the sun slips away. Horses stand tethered in loose lines, their breath rising in pale ghosts. Somewhere, a wolf's distant howl curls through the wind, not a threat, just a reminder that here, life is always watching. This land shapes its people with the same merciless patience that ice shapes stone. The Mongols are born beneath open skies that offer no shelter and no forgiveness. From infancy, the wind scours their skin, the saddle shapes their spine, and hunger teaches them the worth of every drop of milk, every strip of dried meat. To live here is to endure, and to endure is to fight, not only against enemies but against the land itself. In the glow of the dying day, a boy rides ahead of the herds. His hands are numb on the reins, his mind sharp with the knowledge that a single mistake, a misjudged river crossing, a broken horse, can mean death. He has never seen walls of stone or cities of light. His world is motion, survival, and the sharp clarity of the horizon. Above all, he learns this truth early: to be feared is safer than to be pitied. Around the fires, the elders speak of tribes swallowed in a single night, their names unspoken, so that their ghosts do not return. They speak of raids that are as swift as the falcon's dive, where the enemy's horses are driven into panic, their riders scattered, their homes burned before dawn. These are not tales of cruelty for cruelty's sake, but lessons. Each story is a map of survival. Even before they rode beyond the steppe, the seeds of terror had been sown. To these riders, war is not simply the breaking of bodies, it is the breaking of certainty. Strike quickly, vanish into the horizon, and leave the survivors to wonder when you will return. Fear is more loyal than any treaty. The boy listens, his face lit by firelight, eyes reflecting not wonder but calculation. In the darkness beyond the camp, the land waits, vast and indifferent. This is the crucible in which the future is forged, a place where the heart learns to harden, and where mercy is a luxury no one can afford. By the time the riders begin to look outward, beyond the rivers and the mountains, their minds have already learned the shape of power, not in numbers, not in wealth, but in the ability to make an enemy kneel before the first arrow flies. Soon, the world beyond the steppe will feel what this land has taught them: the quiet before the storm, the strike that leaves no room for hope. And in time, the monuments that will rise, not from earth or stone, but from the remains of those who dared resist. The river was black with thaw, carrying shards of ice like drifting teeth. On its far bank, the city still burned. Smoke rose in torn ribbons against the morning sky, and the cries had already thinned to the occasional voice that did not yet understand it was alone. It had begun like so many raids before: swift riders, arrows hissing like insects in the wind, gates splintering before anyone had time to speak the word for surrender. But here something shifted. Genghis Khan no longer saw a need to leave survivors to tell the tale. The elders who might rally resistance, the young who might one day take up arms, they were no longer obstacles to be managed. They were the message. In the early days, destruction was practical. Grain stores taken, herds scattered, fortifications pulled down. But now, the killing became deliberate. Not rage, not frenzy, precision. Houses were set alight only after their doors had been barred from the outside. Those who fled were herded into narrow streets where bowstrings sang at close range. The dead were dragged to the outskirts, their bodies laid in rows like a ledger. The living were taken only to die more slowly. From Otra to Urgench, the pattern deepened. Each campaign carved away hesitation, replacing it with method. The slaughter at Merv, where the inhabitants were counted, divided and executed in groups, showed how death could be measured, tallied and recorded like tribute. The leaders were made to kneel, not before a throne, but before pits already dug into the earth. Among the men who stacked the bodies, there was no shouting, no drunken cruelty, only the steady rhythm of work, the muted grunts of effort, as though they were building walls of stone rather than flesh. And perhaps they were invisible walls of fear that would spread far beyond the city's ruins. Witnesses were no longer the accidental few who escaped. They were chosen, allowed to live, sent back across the plains to speak in trembling voices of what they had seen. And though the skull pyramid itself had yet to take form, its foundation was already there in the silence that followed a Mongol departure, in the emptiness of fields where once there had been children. The man who would be remembered as the Great Khan understood that victory was not the end of war. Victory was the shaping of memory. And memory could be built, one execution at a time, into something more enduring than walls. By the time the fires in that riverside city sank to ash, the air already carried the rumor forward. A new kind of conquest had begun. One that did not seek merely to claim land, but to break the will of those who might one day claim it back. And somewhere in that wind, you can almost hear it forming, the shape of what would come next. A monument not to victory, but to absence. The air was heavy with the smell of iron and dust. Not the scent of the forge, but the deeper metallic bite that clings to a place where blood has seeped into the soil. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the city of Nishapur was no longer a city. It was a carcass. It had begun with grief, a grief that could not be contained, and so it was sharpened into vengeance. The death of Tokacha, son-in-law to Genghis Khan, was more than a personal loss. In the Mongol way, it was an insult written in the language of blood, and blood was the only reply. The orders came not as shouts, but as quiet certainties. No man, no woman, no child was to be spared. The riders poured into the city like a tide that knew no ebb. Those who tried to flee found the gates already barred. Those who tried to hide were pulled into the streets. There was no negotiation, no demand for ransom. In the narrow alleys, the killing was not wild or frenzied. It was meticulous. Heads were taken with the swiftness of long practice. The bodies left where they fell, the skulls gathered as if they were tribute for a distant king. Days passed, though time here lost its meaning. Fires burned themselves out. The wells grew slick with rot. The soldiers moved among the dead with the patience of craftsmen, stripping away the last remnants of flesh, stacking the clean skulls in great, rising walls. Each layer was packed tight, a lattice of bone and hollow sockets, built high enough to cast shadows on the ground where children once played. The chroniclers would later write of it in numbers, 100,000 dead. But numbers have no voice, no breath, no eyes. The truth of Nishapur could not be measured. It could only be felt in the silence that followed, in the way even the wind seemed reluctant to cross that place. And yet, this was more than revenge. This was an unveiling. Here the Mongols perfected the art of fear as architecture. The skull pyramid was not merely a pile of remains. It was a declaration, visible from afar, that resistance was not only futile, but fatal beyond imagining. The people of the surrounding lands would hear the tales from the trembling lips of the few deliberately spared, and they would see the truth for themselves when they drew near, the pale faces of the dead staring in every direction, as if warning all who approached. Some of the builders of that terrible monument were boys not long removed from the steppe, their hands still clumsy with the weight of the sword. They worked in silence, their faces as blank as the skulls they handled. In their eyes there was neither pride nor disgust, only the dull obedience of those who understood that here mercy was treason. When it was done, the city lay beneath a low grey sky, its streets lined not with markets or prayer houses, but with the cold geometry of death. The Mongols rode away, leaving the pyramid to guard what was no longer a city. And for years after, travelers would pass by Nishapur and feel their horses grow restless, their own voices faltering into whispers. The monument still stood, bleaching in the sun, the sockets filling with drifting sand. It did not crumble quickly. Fear rarely does. What began here would travel far, carried on hooves, and whispered in marketplaces until the very name of the Mongols was enough to open gates before their armies arrived. But the shape of the terror was no longer just a threat in the wind. Now it had a face, 1,000 faces. The gates of Samarkand stood open, not from defeat in battle, but from the weight of fear. The people had heard what had been done to Otrar, to Merv, to Nishapur. They had heard of the skull walls, of streets where no living breath remained. And so when the Mongol banners appeared on the horizon, there was no charge, no clash of steel, only the trembling decision to yield before the storm broke. Inside the city, the markets were still rich with silks and spices, the mosques still heavy with incense. The air carried the muted hum of a place trying to pretend it could survive by submission. The elders came forward bearing keys, bowing low, offering tribute, gold, grain, promises. Their voices cracked on each word, as if even these offerings might be found wanting. For a moment, it seemed mercy might come. The Mongol envoys nodded, accepted the keys, and moved through the streets with the steady pace of victors who need not rush. But there was a stillness in their eyes that spoke of decisions already made far beyond these walls. Surrender had opened the gates, but it had not closed the ledger. The killing began not with a scream, but with the single stroke of a blade, then another, then hundreds. Families who had hidden their children in cellars found the doors torn open. Men who had stood watch over the caravans were cut down in the same streets they had once guarded. Women were driven into courtyards and felled beside the fountains where they had drawn water. The bodies were gathered with the same detached precision as in Nishapur, but here the arrangement was more deliberate. Outside the great gates, skulls were stacked into 2 towering spires, each angled so that the hollow sockets stared down the roads from which future travelers might come. The message was not merely to punish Samarkand, but to greet the next city before the Mongols even arrived. The few allowed to live, artisans, scribes, those whose skills could be bent to the Khan's use, were marched past the gates on their way into captivity. They did not look back. Those who did saw the white, grinning faces of their neighbors, friends and kin, rising higher than the walls that had once promised safety. For weeks, the towers of bone caught the light of the sun, their shadows falling long over the road. Wind whistled through the empty sockets, carrying a sound that travelers swore was like low voices, the murmuring of a choir that could not rest. And so the name of Samarkand, once a jewel of trade and learning, became another syllable in the litany of terror. From this point on, the Mongols would no longer need to fight every battle. The skulls would ride ahead of them, in rumor and in memory, and cities would fall without a single arrow loosed. The silent choir would sing across the steppe and into the mountains, its song made not of words, but of the promise of what waited for those who defied the Khan. It was never just the killing. The killing was only the beginning. To the Mongols, the true victory came afterward, in the silence that settled over a land once loud with trade and prayer. That silence was worth more than any wall they could topple or treasury they could empty, because silence spread. It rode faster than their horses, carried by rumor and dread, reaching the next city long before the first banner appeared on the horizon. This was no accident. Genghis Khan understood what most rulers never did. Fear could be engineered. It could be designed, measured, and unleashed, like an arrow aimed not at the body, but at the mind. In his hands, conquest became performance. Every sacked city was a stage, every corpse was a line in the script. And the skull pyramid, it was the curtain call, the part that stayed in the audience's memory long after the riders vanished. The tactics saved lives, Mongol lives. A fortress that had seen its neighbors' walls crowned in bone was far more likely to surrender without resistance. A chieftain who had listened to the trembling account of a spared survivor would think twice before defying the Khan. The cost in enemy lives was staggering, but to the Mongols it was an investment that paid back in bloodless victories elsewhere. This was the calculus: kill enough in one place to avoid killing in the next, break the spirit of one people to bend the will of 100 others, make the horror so vast, so beyond the boundaries of imagination, that no one would ever test it twice. Within the ranks, there were no speeches about justice or divine favor. The orders were cold, precise, and free of ornament. When a city was chosen for obliteration, its fate was sealed before the first hooves struck the dust outside its gates. The number to be spared, if any, was decided not by mercy, but by utility. Craftsmen, translators, siege engineers, everyone else belonged to the message. The work of building the monuments fell to the survivors pressed into service before their own deaths, their hands forced to stack the skulls of neighbors and kin. They knew these towers would stand long after they were gone, and in that knowledge was another layer of cruelty, the condemned made to construct their own warning to the world. The Mongols left no plaques, no inscriptions. The skulls needed no explanation. A merchant crossing the steppe who stumbled upon such a sight would not need to ask whose work it was. And once he turned his horse away, he would carry the story to the next market, the next court, the next frightened ruler. Fear had become a currency, and the Mongols minted it in bone. In the end, it was not the scale of the killing that ensured their victories, but the precision of the message: you cannot fight what you no longer dare to imagine resisting. And somewhere beyond the mountains, more cities still stood, their walls high, their gates strong, but inside, the seeds of surrender had already begun to grow. The walls of Aleppo glowed in the light of the setting sun, a warm amber hue that masked the cold truth inside. The people had heard the stories, Samarkand's silent towers, Nishapur's white graves, but they still clung to their own illusions. Their markets still brimmed with figs and pomegranates. Their scholars still gathered in courtyards to debate words older than any empire. They thought distance and faith might be enough to keep the storm at bay. The storm came anyway. The Mongols did not arrive like thieves in the night. They came in daylight, in the full sight of those who would be undone. Arrows fell first, blackening the air, followed by the slow, relentless press of siege engines. The gates broke, not with a sudden crash, but under a grinding weight that gave the defenders time to feel each heartbeat of their failure. When the city fell, the killings began with the same terrible composure that had marked every conquest before. But here, the slaughter was joined by something else, the unmaking of memory. Libraries were emptied not for plunder, but for destruction. Scrolls that had passed through generations of hands, ink drawn from the earth itself, were thrown into the streets, trampled under the hooves of horses. In the mosques, lamps guttered in the smoke as the prayers turned to screams. From Aleppo, the path to Baghdad was carved not only by the Mongol army, but by the fear they had perfected. Baghdad, jewel of the Abbasid Caliphate, believed itself eternal, its rivers feeding gardens that had bloomed for centuries, its scholars preserving the wisdom of the ancients. Yet when the Mongols reached its gates in the year of reckoning, they found no miracle strong enough to turn them away. The siege was swift, the surrender inevitable. And then came the harvest. Tens of thousands were cut down, their bodies filling the streets and choking the alleys. The great libraries, the House of Wisdom itself, were emptied into the Tigris. Witnesses swore the river ran black with ink for days, then red with blood, as if the city's mind and body had been slain together. The skull pyramids rose again, their white faces reflecting the desert light, but here they stood beside ruins of a different kind, monuments of learning and faith ground to dust. What the Mongols could not carry, they destroyed, so that nothing remained to give shape to the world that had been The survivors, if they could be called that, walked through streets that no longer recognized them. They had no homes, no books, no leaders, only the knowledge that they had been spared to carry the vision of what had been done. And so the fear spread farther still, because now it was not just the threat of death that awaited those who defied the Khan, it was the certainty of erasure. In Aleppo, in Baghdad, the wind moved through the gaps in the skull walls and the broken arches of mosques alike, its voice carrying a single truth: there are deaths of the body, and there are deaths of the world. Here the Mongols had given both. Long after the riders had vanished, the land still bore their handwriting, not in ink, not in stone, but in bone. Across the edges of the conquered world, the Mongols left their monuments standing, not as trophies but as warnings. Each skull pyramid became a boundary marker more binding than any treaty, declaring where their reach had ended. For now, travelers would crest a hill or follow a river bend, and there it would be white against the horizon, stark as winter light. You did not need to read the language to understand what it meant. In some places they rose in the open plain, visible for miles, the sockets of 1,000 faces staring into the wind. In others they loomed at crossroads, so no caravan could pass without feeling the weight of their gaze. They did not crumble quickly. Sun and rain polished them to a dull, brittle shine. The wind sifted fine dust into the hollows, but the shapes remained. Years could pass before a Mongol patrol returned, yet no one dared cross the invisible line they marked. Shepherds grazed their flocks far away. Merchants took long detours, losing weeks to avoid them. Children were warned never to wander near, lest they hear voices on the wind or find themselves lost in the shadow of the dead. The chroniclers from distant lands wrote of these monuments with equal parts horror and fascination. To them they were proof of Mongol dominance, a visible frontier of fear. To those who lived near them, they were a constant reminder that even in peace they lived under a sentence that could be carried out at any time. For the Mongols, this permanence was the point. Armies could not be everywhere, but fear could. Each pyramid was a sentry that never slept, a soldier that never left its post. And so the empire held not only through movement and conquest, but through the stillness of these structures. Sometimes the skulls were not anonymous. Survivors swore they could recognize a friend, a father, a wife, their features forever stripped to pale geometry. Recognition became another wound, deepening the scar until it was part of the landscape itself. Seasons changed, empires rose and fell around them, but the borders of bone endured. They were not just relics of a past slaughter, they were living boundaries, shaping the choices of those who still breathed. In this way, the Mongols had found a way to extend their power beyond distance, beyond time. A fortress might fall, a garrison might desert, but a skull pyramid did not need to be maintained. It did not cost silver, nor rations, nor manpower. It cost only the memory of the dead, a currency they had in limitless supply. And so the wind moved over these borders without resistance, whispering in every language the same unspoken decree: you are already conquered. The pyramids were gone. The wind had taken them, grain by grain, scattering the skulls into gullies and riverbeds, burying them under drifts of sand. Time had blurred their edges, broken their brittle crowns, carried them into the soil. Yet the emptiness they left behind was heavier than the monuments themselves. For those who lived in their shadow, the fear did not vanish when the last bone fell. It lived on in the pauses between words, in the careful way travelers avoided certain roads, in the way children were warned never to wander too far, lest they step onto cursed ground. Villages rebuilt, but never where the towers had stood. The earth there was considered unclean, a place where even grass might refuse to grow. Stories carried the terror farther than hooves ever could. In markets, old men spoke of the Mongols, not as soldiers, but as a force of nature, a storm that could be seen days away but never outrun. Women whispered to their children of skull walls taller than houses, of silent cities where not even dogs barked. The details changed with each telling, but the shape of the fear remained the same. Some spoke of hearing voices when the wind rose at night, a low moan curling over the plains, as if the dead still called to the living. Others swore they had seen pale faces in the dust storms, sockets wide and empty, vanishing as quickly as they appeared. The rational dismissed such visions, but even they avoided traveling alone after dark. Generations passed, and still the memory clung, not because the people could not forget, but because forgetting felt dangerous, as if to let go of the fear was to invite its return. The Mongols themselves were gone, their empire fractured into shards, but their presence was written into the land like a brand that could not be scrubbed away. And so, long after the last skull pyramid had collapsed, the borders it marked remained intact in the minds of those who survived. Not lines on a map, but invisible thresholds, guarded by silence and superstition. The dust kept its secrets, but when the wind was right, and the plains stretched empty beneath the pale sky, there were those who swore they could still feel it, the weight of eyes that were no longer there. The stories that reached distant courts were not always of slaughter. Some spoke of the Mongols as disciplined visionaries, masters of the horse, the bow, and the wind. They were said to be bringers of order, builders of trade routes, unifiers of distant lands. In these versions, the blood was washed away, the ash swept from the streets, leaving only the gleam of conquest. But beneath the polish, the bones remained. Archaeologists still find them, scattered in riverbeds, buried shallow beneath the dust of centuries. Chroniclers of the time, unsoftened by nostalgia, left their accounts in ink that has outlived the hands that wrote it. Whole cities emptied, the dead arranged in pale monuments, the living enslaved or driven into exile. The reality is not a tale of noble warfare, it is a ledger written in flesh. The legend thrives because it is cleaner. Empires are easier to admire when their foundations are invisible. But walk the plains where the pyramids once stood, and the air is still wrong, too still, too sharp, as though the land itself remembers. No trade route, no diplomatic treaty can erase the silence that lingers there. To call it glory is to look away. To praise the reach of the Mongols without seeing the skull walls is to stand before a pyre and speak only of its warmth. The truth is harder, heavier. That power was maintained not by the will of those who followed, but by the terror of those who submitted. The skull pyramids were not accidents of rage. They were deliberate, repeated, refined. They were the spine of an empire whose image has been half remembered and half rewritten until the monuments became whispers and the whispers became myth. Yet even in myth, the shadow of the truth remains. You can gild the name of the great Khan, you can trace the roads he opened, you can marvel at the speed of his armies, but if you listen closely, beneath the hoofbeats, you can hear the sound of hollow sockets turning toward you. The legend may have survived the centuries, but so have the bones. It stood alone. The city it had guarded was long gone, its streets swallowed by weeds, its walls reduced to uneven mounds beneath the dust. Only the pyramid remained, its edges softened by wind and time, but its shape still unmistakable. From a distance it could have been mistaken for stone. Up close, the truth was in the brittle sheen of bone, in the way the sockets gaped toward the horizon as though still watching for enemies who would never come. No one remembered the names of the dead. The survivors had carried them for a time, whispering them over graves, etching them into scraps of wood, murmuring them in the dark. But names are fragile things. They fade when no one speaks them, crumble when no one dares. The Mongols had known this. Erasure was more final than death. Seasons turned, the empire fractured, and the riders no longer came. The pyramid began to sink into the earth, skulls loosening from their places and tumbling into the grass. Children from nearby villages would sometimes creep close to snatch one, for a game, for a charm, until the elders pulled them away, warning of curses that did not sleep. By the time a wandering trader passed and took note of it, most of the structure had collapsed, its bones scattered like pale seeds in the dirt. He told the tale in the next market he reached, not because he feared the Mongols would return, but because the sight had unsettled him in a way he could not name. It was not the violence it recalled, but the weight of its stillness. And in that stillness lay the final victory. Even as the wind reclaimed it, the pyramid had done its work. It had stood long enough to ensure that those who saw it and those who heard of it would remember the message, not the battles, not the names, only the warning. When the last skull rolled into the earth and was hidden by the grass, Nothing marked the place anymore. Nothing, except the knowledge that somewhere, someone would always remember the shape of it and the truth it carried. Some monuments are built to honor the dead. This one had been built to make the living kneel.